Size, shading, overlapping is the other one. Got one element on top of the other. So from here you can see, you can get an idea of perspective. Things are going off to one or more vanishing points from here. This one was really cool. A lot of times, especially if you have a building or some sort of object that's going into perspective, if you put the text or if you put other things into that perspective, it really adds a sense of depth. There's a plane there that things are sitting on. A lot of times you can simply make the decorative elements become three-dimensional. They're overlapping, they're going down to some sort of point. In this case, they're overlapping. They've got a little bit of a drop shadow from one plane to the next. That way it looks like things are on different areas. Sometimes you can have one texture or one thing peeling away. This is called a trompe-l'oeil effect. Trompe-l'oeil is a French word for fool the eye. So it looks like the paper is being torn apart, and it gives you that one. Sometimes you can simply work with another thing. So that is on one plane, your information is on another plane. A lot of times it's as simple as making this if this was just a regular flat layout, it'd be a two-column style of layout. This one, got a three-dimensional object, things are going into perspective. It adds a lot of drama to an otherwise boring style of layout. There it is, working with the streets. One thing to pay attention to whenever you lay out this, your elements on here, is make sure everything is readable. If you've got text going off into a distance, eventually it's just going to become so small and so squished out of the way, you're not going to be able to read it very easily. You're almost running into that with Chicago. That C, if it kept on going, would be unreadable from that point. Sometimes, you can rotate it within multiple things. I love this one. This is giving a sense of depth just because you've got a person and things are on top of him or going behind him. It doesn't always have to be a nice dramatic angular single or double point perspective. As long as there's a sense of depth in there, things are on different planes, that's what you're going for from that one. I think that's the last one. So those are examples of planar setups. Let me show you my example that I created for our project. We're taking the same information, all the information about the Department of Art, the pictures, the text, and we're trying to lay it out. In our case, I've done tabloid-sized poster. If it decides to open up quickly. And I've put each of the elements onto my poster, and I've used just here is my particular layout. And like I said, I used a variety of different mediums to lay out everything that I have. I gave myself, starting off with just a regular flat surface. That's the yellow background. From here, I built on many different elements. Some are going into a one-point perspective. Other things are just using the shadows, the drop shadows and the inner shadows to give that sense of depth or different planes on here. Like I said, you can mix these up, but do pay attention that things will fit inside of here. Ooh. That's cool. It's a glitch type of art. But yeah, make sure things are staying inside of here and working within that. We'll go back to this as my example. So if I was to set it up, I've given everybody your instructions. As before, I'm not giving you step-by-step instructions. I'm showing you how to create a variety of shapes, create text and put it and distort it into 3D, how to add and remove drop shadows and inner shadows. Take what I'm showing you, create your own design from it. As far as the setup goes, we'll keep it a tabloid size, 11 by 17. It can be either portrait or landscape. Set our resolution to 300, and I'm going to work in RGB color mode for now. We'll say OK. In my case, I'll just keep it like this. The first thing we'll do is I'm going to show you how to use the vector graphics in Photoshop. Now, Photoshop is pixel-based, so it's all raster. Ultimately, it becomes rasterized. But that doesn't mean you can't put vector points and objects into Photoshop. I'll zoom in so we can see what we're working on. All of your vector tools are located towards the bottom of your toolbox. These sets of 4 right here. And if you click and hold on them, they're going to look very familiar from Illustrator. You got your pen tool, you got a free-flowing, freehand drawing pen tool, add and delete anchor points, all those are the same. You even have vector selection tools. Pay attention to this. The selection tools, the path selection tools, are going to be different from your regular black arrow that we've used before. This will allow you to move things on a layer. These are specific to vector objects. So if you're only wanting to change those up, make sure you're using this set of arrows. And then of course you got your type and some pre-made shapes tools that you can work with. As far as making objects go, I'm going to use just a regular rectangle. Here's what you got to remember when making shapes in Photoshop. There's 3 different things that you can do. I've got my shape selected. Look at the very top. Here are our tool options. If I click on shape, here's the 3 different kinds of shapes we can make. If I choose a shape, click and drag, it'll give me this style of object. You can see in my layers palette, I've got a rectangle. It's got its own little icon. It lets me know that this is a vector rectangle. And if I wanted to move it around, I'll use my direct selection tool. I can click on the points and move them around as if it was an Illustrator object. Nothing out of the ordinary about this. Also notice in my paths palette, paths will track out any type of vector path that you've created. If I was to choose my rectangle again, this time instead of choosing shape, I just choose path and draw off a rectangle. It's not going to fill it in with a color. It's not going to give me my own layer. It's just going to create a path that I can work in. And there's other things you can do with paths in Photoshop that involve your brushes or making selections, but it's not what we're going to use for this project. So don't choose path. If you choose pixel, initially it's saying, hey, I can't make something. Here's the reason why. With pixels, I need to have, I'll undo that, I need to have just a regular blank layer to work on. So I've got a new transparent layer. Now when I click and drag on it, it'll make the object that I have, excuse me, fill it in with my fill color. But in this case, it's not a vector object. It's just turned into a pixelated object. If I was to choose my direct selection tool, I can't really select it or move it. I've just turned pixels into that particular color. So what we're going to be working with, I'll delete away our layer. We want to make sure you've got your shape selected. The second thing you can do with shape is you can change the fill, the stroke, and all the other options that go along with it. So if I needed to change it from this dirty brown to say more of a yellow, I can change my fill color and it's changed up as well. If I wanted to give it a stroke of green, change the size of it, this will allow me to do that from there because it's a shape. Any other one's not going to do it. For ours, we're not going to need a stroke. We're just going to keep it one particular object shape. Tell you what, I'll erase this away. Let's start making some different planes. So click and drag it out. The simplest method to make this look like it's going into some sort of perspective is simply to drag one of the 2 points towards a vanishing point. Y'all remember vanishing points from drawing 1? Hopefully so. Hopefully you've used this before. With my white arrow direct selection tool, I can click on those points and simply drag it straight down and pull that one up. And now it looks like this edge is going off into one particular point. If I was to just move 1 point, this kind of gets into a 3-point perspective. May or may not be what you want to get into, but again, it does look like it's a plane going off in one direction. If I needed to, if I wanted to make, say, another plane going off this area, or tell you what, we'll move this over and copy it to here. I'm going to do this the wrong way first. I'm going to show you why it's the wrong way. I'll use my selection tool, select my path, and we'll copy and paste it. Edit copy, edit paste. Pasted it on top of this particular area. So now all I've got to do is to match it up with this side. We'll use our white arrow. Click on this edge. Oops. We'll move everything into place. Come on now. Right about there. We'll change the color. So since this side is a different plane, it needs to be a lighter color. I change it to be lighter. Uh-oh, what happened? Whole thing changed. I just wanted that one side to change. Told you I was going to do it wrong the first time. Here's why that happened. If you only select the path, check out my layers palette. It still has just the one layer that I'm working on. Even though I've got 2 different objects in there, it's treating it as kind of one object. So I'm going to erase that one away. This time, I'm going to make a copy of this layer. And the easiest thing to do, I'll pull this up, is to drag this down to your new layer icon. Now I've got a rectangle copy. It's on top of this one. Now with it in a different layer, if I changed it around, I can start to do that. And when I change the color of it, make it lighter or darker, you can see it's on a different plane by itself. Did I lose anybody? The main thing to remember about that, don't simply copy and paste it because it's going to paste in the same layer. Copy the layer itself and then work within that particular new layer. If you look in my example that I showed y'all, every single thing here has its own layer inside of it. So I've got tons and tons of layers. Most of these are just copies of the same rectangle, and then I've changed up and morphed those up from there. So if I wanted to add on another plane on the other side, we'll make a copy of this rectangle. Use my selection tools, and then change the color of it. If I am changing the color, I would want it to match the same, roughly the same plane that would be on for this one, lighter or darker, depending on how it is from there. Pretty cool. So now I've got my different objects, and I can match those up to work from there. Let's start adding some text to it. Tell you what, I'll zoom in. We'll get rid of this guy. We'll work on these two. So let's say I wanted to add text on one side and text on the other side to this one, and put it into perspective as well. You've got your type tool. With it, give it a second to load up. I'm going to click once and just create a line of text. I'm not using an entire body copy. So I've got my blinking cursor from here. We can put our headline type from that. We'll hit the checkbox. Now I can use my move tool and put it into place. If I needed to, I can scale it up. What I want to do is I want to warp it so that it moves along the same planar path as the background is. If I go to Edit and Transform, I can scale it, rotate it, and skew it. What I really want to do is to distort it. There's also a perspective distort, and I'll show you that as well, but the regular distort is what I want. It's not lit up. The reason why is you can't distort a text box. Photoshop just doesn't like it. I don't know why, but that's the way it's set up. But we're going to trick it. Rather than working in a simple or a regular text layer, we're going to convert this layer to a smart object, and that will allow us to do a distortion of it. So I've got my text selected under under Layer, Smart Objects, Convert to Smart Object. Now check out my layer once it's finished. Now it converts it to this. It's got its own little special icon. If I go to Edit and Transform, now I've got my distortion. From here, I can click on the edges, and it will automatically put it into the perspective that I'm looking for. Again, I'm using my background kind of as a guide to make sure everything looks good. When I'm done, hit your check mark, hit return. Now I've got it set off from there. Let's do something on the other side. Type tool, just click once, type out something. If I need to, I can drag it onto here. Do a basic, scale it up. Need to convert this to a smart object. So under Layer, Smart Objects, and Convert. Once it's converted, I can now do my distortion. Under Transform. Here's what perspective allows you to do. Perspective, if I click on one area, will also put the other side in perspective as well. The downside to this is it's a little bit more difficult to play around with. I can't move it left to right, in and out. I can move it up and down, which is okay. But for this, it's kind of difficult to place things exactly where I want it to be. If I use Distort, I can place the edges right where I want them to be. I can even put things into a 3-point perspective a lot quicker. So I tend to like to use regular Distort. Hit Return, hit Enter. Now it's locked in from here. Did I lose everybody? That's how you can put text or any type of object into a 3-dimensional distortion. If you need to change something that's in a smart object layer, so let's say I wanted to change the title or the color of this, you can double click on the icon, the actual thumbnail, not the name but the thumbnail. This will give you a warning saying, hey, you're about to edit it. Make sure you save your edits. We'll say OK to that. And it'll open everything up in its own separate dialog box. So from here, I can actually type out something else. And I can scale it to fit it inside my area. Maybe change the color of it. We'll make it that. Once I'm satisfied with this, remember I'm in my own separate tab. Save it up. And when I close it, when I come back to here, it's automatically been changed up from there. I won't be able to change the text from this document. I have to double click on the thumbnail and open it up in a separate tab to make the changes from that. And so that's how I did it for Department of Art. I think of needs a little bit more work, but I placed everything on its own particular plane, scaled it around, and moved it from here. Another thing just to keep in mind, I don't really care too much about true perspective. And if this was an actual object, yeah, I would want to have a horizontal line. I would want to have a good vanishing point and everything going to that vanishing point. For this particular grid structure, you don't always have to have the same vanishing point. You can have things just moving along. As long as they're receding, getting smaller as they go back, that's okay. And you can play around with the perspective of the objects that are on top of it. If I wanted to place a picture in here and actually distort it up, we'll go to File and Place. And let's see if I can open up one of the artworks. Let's choose a good one. Come on. We'll choose this guy. Once it's placed in here, of course, the first thing it's going to ask me to do is to place it and resize it. Check out what kind of layer it is. What is that? It's a smart object. When you place it in there, it'll place it as a smart object. This way I can scale it down and do stuff with it without losing my quality. If I needed to distort it, go to Edit and Transform. There's my Distort. Here's the thing about distorting images versus text. It'll eventually reach a point where the aspect ratio, the height and the width, is going to look way off. If I left it like that, that's going to be distorting the image way too much. So I wouldn't want to do that. If you're going to put it in perspective, pay attention to what a proper perspective should look like based on this. So that would be something a little bit better. That would obviously be way too stretched out. In general, I tend to stay away from distorting images like this simply because it does get kind of tricky. If I was to place that on there, just do it very, very carefully. If I'm going to place images on there, I try to keep them as flat as possible so that they're a little bit easier to read and easier to see. But the main thing is make sure it's a smart object that you can distort it and work with that one. Then it's simply a matter of lining it up with whatever plane you want it to go in. Let's see. Edit, Transform, Distort. Way too much. Maybe I could bring it in. And redistort it as well. Okay, so there's that. Distort things however you want it to be distorted as well. If you do have a body copy of text, I'm just going to click and drag, and in this case I'm just going to type out some random words. We'll say that this is a body copy. You can put this into perspective. Come on. There we go. If I was to convert this to a smart object, we'll zoom into it. Got the layers selected, smart object, convert. Now if I was to distort it, it would look something like this. You're getting that opening credits to the Star Wars kind of feel with that. Very difficult to read versus very distorted from down here. So as far as body copy goes, you probably don't want to distort it too much like this, or do so at your own risk. In the examples that we looked at, you saw how it was just barely distorted, but you could still easily read it from there. Though that may be the type of thing you're going for. All right, so that's linear perspective type distortions. What about plane distortions or perspective? How can we put things on two different planes? I'm going to draw off another text box. In this case, let's say I wanted to have a text box and I wanted to put text inside of it. With this one, if I choose my type tool, watch my type tool change as I hover on top of it. See how it becomes a circle? When I click now, it doesn't take the object and turn it into a text box. Instead, it makes it a text box on a separate layer. From here, I can type inside of it. If I needed to change the size of my text box, I can click and drag that in, and it's not going to affect the brown that's behind it. Okay, if I wanted to put it on a separate layer, I've got my rectangle layer selected. Down at the bottom are your effects, and we'll just add a drop shadow to that one. With the drop shadow, simply play around with your different things. You can make it more spread out, change the size of it, change the opacity of it, change the distance of it. This gives the illusion that there's some distance between one object and the other object. If you need to, you can even change up your direction of your light to work from there. Another type of shadow you can work with is your inner shadow. So if I wanted it to look like this plane was behind the white layer, adding an inner shadow, in this case, drops the shadow inside of the object. And depending on the distance and how you want it to be, that gives the illusion of depth for this particular plane. You would never want to do a drop shadow and an inner shadow together. An object like that just probably wouldn't exist in the real world. Final thing about drop shadows, this is my personal preference, I never leave the color of it as a solid black. Change the color to match whatever color scheme that you're working on. So if I've got a lot of browns, simply open it up and choose something from a warmer, browner tone. That'll blend a little bit better with your overall design. I'll say OK to this. If you look at my example, so for instance, this area inside of here has an inner drop shadow, inner shadow. So it looks like this part is cut and it's behind that one. As far as the pictures go, they've got a stroke outline and they've got a drop shadow underneath them. Looks like they pop forward from that. As far as the undergraduate and graduate information, they're in their own separate boxes. Those boxes have drop shadows, and the headlines to them have their own little separate elements that looks like the illusion of depth. That's basically it. That's the essence of working with a planar design. You're giving the illusion of depth for all of your elements. Let's back it up from here. Questions on this? How you get it set up and everything? Cool. The only thing you're doing, make sure you've got all the text on this particular one. By the way, this was another question that came up in our last class. There's no way of placing text into here. You will have to open up your text document in Microsoft Word and copy and paste the text into here once you get it. It doesn't work like InDesign or Illustrator where you can flow the text into this. Once you get it set up, as far as how you want the planes to go, I'll leave that up to you. Whatever dimensions that you want to do, I'll leave that up to you as well. Okay? All right, I'll stop recording, turn your computers back